Thank you all for being here. Nicole is on her nice vacation up in Washington, so send her some love and time for renewal and rest. And so I'm preaching today, and then my friend, the Reverend Nancy Nero, is preaching next Sunday, and she is a pastor in Denver who works primarily in hospice and end of life, and she also just wrote her dissertation and got her D.Min, and she is preaching on white supremacy and the United Church of Christ. So don't miss that. Will definitely be a sermon about anti-racism. And then in 2 weeks, our good friend, whose name is escaping me, Karen Howe, is going to be preaching and offering communion. So got wonderful coverage while Nicole is on vacation. So this text, as I was praying with the scripture text, I have a practice of doing Lectio Divina. So it's a practice where we do it in the 8 o'clock service, but you read the scripture over and over and over and kind of let it sift in. And here's kind of how my mind went during my process. So first I was drawn to the line in the scripture, let them grow together, referring to the plant and the weed. And then I went that there's a temptation to get rid of what is bad or what we don't agree with. And then I was like, well, what do we focus on? What do we see? Do we see the plant or do we see the weed? Do we see our work or do we pay attention to the distractions? Do we focus on hope or despair? Do we focus on our dream for justice or do we focus on all the naysayers and the reasons why something can't work or what we want to do won't help? And I came to, in my time of silence, that Jesus is pointing to a third way. Not either or, but both and. Is it really up to us to judge? Or are we to focus on our mission, our calling, what's in front of us right now? Many of you know that Nicole and Kathy and I represented this congregation and the Denver Metro Association and the Rocky Mountain Conference at the United Church of Christ General Synod a few weeks ago, and we were promoting our resolution on Guns to Gardens. And for those of you who don't know much about it yet, it's a resolution to work towards ending gun violence. And Kathy kept reminding Nicole and I over and over about our mission to plant seeds, because you can't have a garden without first planting seeds. And I think for many of us in this congregation, God planted the seeds to do something to address gun violence long before that March 2021 massacre right down the street. And sprouts began coming up after that, and they continue to grow. We keep listening and discerning despite the weeds that also sprout. During our time at Synod, we allowed ourselves to trust that the Spirit is working to help address gun violence. We had a singular message. God calls us from Scripture to turn swords into plowshares, and individuals, congregations, associations, and conferences can do something in their context to do just that. We did not stray from that message. We did not let the weeds and distractions sway us. Weeds like society saying, nothing can be done, nothing's going to change. Weeds like, it's always going to be this way. Weeds like, no one's going to listen. Weeds like, I have the right to own a gun. Weeds like, how are we going to raise money? Weeds like, is it safe to do a Guns to Gardens event? And there were certainly weeds during our committee time. One was about the title of our resolution, which was called Affirming Guns to Gardens. Because some people felt like It sounded too soft and too wishy-washy or something like that. I didn't really follow it all. And then there was, no joke, a 50-minute, 50, conversation about the verbiage using the word individual or members of congregations can do 50 minutes to talk about individuals or members. And then, because that wasn't enough, someone came in late, like 90 minutes into the committee time, and was loud. "What did I miss?" Like he yelled, "What did I miss?" to the whole room. Now, any of these weeds could have derailed the whole thing. Because I don't know about you, but haven't you ever been in a room where you're working on something with a group of people and someone says something and it takes you off into a different direction, and then you never do get to talk about what you're there for? I know I have. But you know what happened? By the end of that committee time, which was about 2.5 or 3 hours, the distractions or weeds were funny, and some were discarded and some were transformed. But the other beautiful thing that happened was we planted seeds of hope. Seeds that indeed each person can do something. And those seeds sprouted and took hold. By the end of that committee time, there were about 60, somewhere between 60 and 70 people in the room, and they owned that resolution like they wrote it themselves. They were already thinking about what they were going to do when they went home in their own context. And then when we got to the floor of the plenary and the committee chair and I presented the resolution to be then voted on, I looked onto the sea of people, and by sea I mean somewhere between 700 and 800 people. We looked out onto the sea of people, and they have green microphones for you're speaking in favor and a red microphone you're speaking against. And the line at the sea of green was endless. And our committee members were the first in line to speak about why they were supporting it. And they started planting more seeds. It was really something to behold. Not one person went to the red. And many of you know, our resolution passed by the widest margin of any resolution at the event, and there were 14. You cannot have a garden without seeds. And maybe there will be weeds and distractions, but as Jesus says in the parable, stay focused. Let the good seeds take hold, sprout, grow, and thrive. Pulling them is sometimes counterproductive. In the parable, he implies, let the good seeds do their job. And so about the weeds. I want to thank Judy Wise, who she came to the 8 o'clock service, and then the 9 o'clock service, she went and picked us some weeds from our property here, right around the labyrinth. Thank you, Judy. So we have props. I found myself literally thinking about weeds that I deal with on a regular basis. I'm guessing most of you do too. And being the good UCC person, I don't use chemicals. So they thrive on our property. I have 5.5 acres of a lot of weeds. So first, dandelions. I have a really hard time calling them weeds. I know it's controversial. I love them. The bees love them. And they're the first flowers of the year that the bees can get food from. My horses love them too. And that blanket of yellow in April and May bring me happiness after all of our long winter of blah. Bindweed, on the other hand, drives me nuts. It is pretty, but they make a huge, terrible mess in my round pen where I have clients working with horses, and it looks like a disaster. But the horses love eating it. And I have discovered that bees and ladybugs live in it. I have thousands of ladybugs. And those little flowers, well, those are really pretty and intricate as well. And I'm learning to live with it. Bindweed. How about thistle? Thistle is not just a weed, but in Boulder and Larimer County, probably all over Colorado, it's labeled as a noxious invasive weed. And quite honestly, I can't keep up with it. Over Memorial Day weekend, I dug out literally 5 large bags of thistle that I threw away, but now they are literally everywhere, and they are in full, glorious bloom. And I have one thistle that, no kidding, is taller than me. And the other day, as I was looking at it, thinking, oh, what are my clients going to think when they come to my property and look at all this thistle? This beautiful bumblebee landed on it and went from bloom to bloom to bloom, gathering her nectar, and I was mesmerized. Who needs television when you've got a bee and thistle? And then a few minutes later, a hummingbird came by. So I've given up this summer trying to do anything about the weeds. Number one, I have an injured arm. Many of you know that, and I'm just plain too tired and cannot keep up. And as the call to worship referenced, dandelions are resilient and persevere, and they grow in harsh conditions, and so do the bindweed and the thistle. So I wonder, is there something we can learn from the literal weeds in our gardens or our property or the weeds in our lives that try to pop up and stop us from our calling or something that we're focused on? Do they have gifts for us, like the bee? What if we take the good and the bad and learn from them instead of trying to eradicate them? Might that be the third way that Jesus was talking about, making room to learn from them and not just dismiss, destroy, ignore, or get rid of them? Maybe yes, and maybe no. Maybe it just depends. When I sang in Resonance Chorus, one year we sang a song that went like this. I'm not going to try to sing it because now I'm too nervous, but here are the lyrics. Make some room for the left out. Make some room for the angry. Make some room for not knowing how to make room. Make room. What if, like the parable, we make room for the weeds, things we don't understand, or the distractions? What might happen? I shared in the 9 o'clock story that I know that Kathy and Nicole haven't shared about something that happened at Synod. That's my story. It was definitely a weed, and not just a weed, it was a noxious weed. And for those of you who think that homophobia is not real or is not a thing in the United Church of Christ, I'm here to tell you it's alive. During the time at Synod, they passed 2 resolutions, one called Actively Affirming the Human Dignity of Transgender and Non-Binary Persons. It's beautiful. And another one, a resolution supporting public school educators, academic freedom, and equity efforts in schools. Both of these resolutions passed with no problems on the floor, and again, no one spoke against it. There were votes against it, but nobody spoke against it. But it still passed. And both of these resolutions addressed injustices facing LGBTQ plus people and addressed efforts to silence the teaching of history from points of view of historically marginalized people, including people of color, and called on the UCC to speak up and be active in these movements for justice. And still, in what appeared to be a welcoming and affirming event, I was approached by a guest of Synod. I realized later that he chose me and not Nicole or Kathy, even though the 3 of us were standing together. We were in the back. We were all easy to approach. But here's my other prop. I had my water bottle sitting on the chair. And this is why he approached me. He introduced himself to me like any other person I had met over the 5 days, and then the conversation took a turn. There is a